chair this panel discussion that's focused on breaking barriers to trial enrollment. So this is certainly not an area that I'm an expert in, although I think I passed a Holiday Inn Express on the train up from DC last night. But I'm really fortunate to have these four panelists here who've thought a lot more than I have about this issue, and are hopefully we can have a lively discussion about some of the questions that I had and that the field is facing in terms of trying to make the trials more representative. If you're the NCI of the catchment area in which the cancer centers sit, or if you're the FDA, maybe the patient population with the disease. But first, I'm going to ask our panelists, starting with you, Rick, to just introduce yourself and then say just a little bit about the constituency you might be representing.
Okay. My name is Rick Bangs. I'm a survivor of bladder and prostate cancer. I'm the patient advocate for bladder cancer at SWOG. I also chair the Patient Advocate Committee. SWOG Cancer Research Network, for those that are not aware, is funded by the National Cancer Institute. And it is what used to be called a cooperative group, now called a network. All right, so it's a member institutions. And I'm co-leading some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion transformation at SWOG.
Jose Perez. I'm the medical affairs responsible for the GU portfolio in Exelixis. And I want to add that my comments will reflect my opinion and may not match exactly what Exelixis is doing with diversity and inclusion in clinical trials.
Hi, I'm Chana Weinstock, delighted to be here. I'm a medical oncologist by training. I'm one of the GU oncology team leads at the FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence. And thank you so much for having me.
Subramaniam Hariharan, Global Medical Affairs in Pfizer Oncology. I've been there for 19 years and had the pleasure of working with many of you, having launched many drugs in kidney cancer. I'm a neuro-oncologist by training, and today I'll represent what Pfizer Oncology has been doing about diversity in clinical trials.
Great. So now I'm going to ask Dr. Weinstock to give us a little bit of background on why this is important, at least to the FDA, that we have diverse populations in clinical trials. So go ahead.
Thank you. So absolutely. I want to thank the organizers for convening this panel and bringing this topic to the forefront of kidney cancer. And, you know, this is a topic, increasing diversity in clinical trial enrollment is a topic that's extremely important to the FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence. It really always has been, but in the past few years, the importance of this topic has been formalized in several efforts, and I'd like to highlight a couple of them today. One of them is Project Equity, which is a project that aims to increase diversity of clinical trial participants in oncology. Another one is Project Silver, which aims to improve the evidence base for treating older adults with cancer. You're going to hear this topic come up a lot when you interact with us at the FDA. If any of you have been in sponsor meetings with our team, we will bring this up increasingly early in drug development, that you need to come up with a diversity plan and address how your trial is going to be the most representative it can be. And if anyone has been listening, there have been several meetings of the Oncologic Drug Advisory Committee at the FDA, not necessarily in GU cancers lately, but other cancers have come up. And the topic of diversity and representativeness in clinical trials definitely comes up in that setting as well. So, you know, if there's a trial that enrolls and it does not seem to be diverse or representative, then that can be an issue that we talk about when the results come in. So you're going to hear this more and more at an increasingly early stage of drug development. So there's a draft guidance that came out in April 2022 that's available on FDA.gov. And one of the things that guidance talks about in terms of increasing diversity in trial enrollment is that sponsors or drug companies need to come up with a diversity plan, and that needs to be something that's thought about very early in the drug development process. And we basically say no later than at the end of phase 2 stage. So when you're really talking about doing your clinical trial that's going to be registrational, or that's going to be the data that you're trying to use to get your drug approved, this has to be something that you're thinking about beforehand. And we'd like to see that formalized in a plan. So that's what the draft guidance addresses. In terms of kidney cancer, so I was talking about, everything I've talked about refers to oncology in general and all oncology clinical trials. Kidney cancer in general. So Mr. Bangs and I were on a panel at ASCO 2021 dealing with this exact topic, and we actually co-authored an educational book chapter on this topic. And just generally, as you all know, kidney cancer is one of the top 10 most commonly diagnosed cancers in this country, and the incidence, unfortunately, is rising. And we know that there's a disparity in outcomes, and not every patient diagnosed with kidney cancer has the same chances of survival and of doing equally well. And we get trial data at the FDA from the drugs that have been approved, and we have the chance to look at those trials, sometimes with aggregate data where we look across clinical trials that have come in. And for that panel, I did a look at the makeup of those trials. And one thing that's very apparent is that the overwhelming majority of patients enrolled in those trials are white, ranging from 75% to 87%. Black patients, who make up over 10% of kidney cancer patients in this country, were only 1.6% of enrolled patients on several registrational trials at the FDA when you look at them in aggregate. Older adults, we know that the median age of diagnosis of kidney cancer, it's a disease that does affect older adults. Proportionally, I think the age is about 64, but the median age of clinical trial enrollment was under 61.
Yeah,
so we do have a ways to go in kidney cancer specifically. It would be a why do we think it's important that things change?
Or OS.
So I'd like to highlight two major reasons that at the FDA we think
maybe
that increasing diversity and the diverse makeup of a clinical trial is important.
What our fear is for
the first one is from an equity standpoint. So we know that when a patient is enrolled in a clinical trial, their chances of a better outcome increase just by virtue of the fact they've been given access to a clinical trial. So if there's a barrier to trial enrollment that doesn't need to be there, we're going to try to take it away. And that's across the board, whether it's an organ impairment or brain metastases or something that's keeping a patient off a trial for an arbitrary reason. From an equity standpoint, that barrier should not be there, so that the patient has the best chance at getting the best care possible on a clinical trial. The second one, and this is from a regulatory standpoint, when we approve a drug, we want to make sure that the safety and efficacy data that we have from the clinical trial best represent the patient population that's going to be using the drug. So if your clinical trial is not diverse in terms of whether it's ethnic makeup, whether it's age ranges, whether it's organ impairment, and you're giving us your clinical trial data, but then that drug is going to be used in the real world, we don't have a really good idea of what the results will be in the real world population that's going to use the drug. So that's why we try to develop strategies to enroll patients that are traditionally excluded from clinical trials. And that's something that we do across the board at the Oncology Center of Excellence. And again, I mentioned Project Equity, which is the Oncology Center of Excellence public health initiative to make sure that the data that's submitted to us for approval best represents the population that's going to be using that drug. Whether it's rural populations, whether it's individuals with economic, linguistic, cultural barriers to healthcare, that all of those patients are taken into account when you're enrolling your clinical trial. So I thank you again for inviting me, and I look forward to a robust discussion on the topic.
Yes. So thank you, Dr. Weinstock, for that introduction. And maybe we'll move to the second question, which I think just dovetails from your discussion. And I'm going to ask Harry, you to potentially start about, just describe some efforts that your organization is involved in to relax the eligibility criteria for clinical trials, to make trials more representative of the community with the disease, particularly to increase enrollment of minorities, and then maybe expand to other groups such as the AYA community or the elderly community or people with bad performance status, et cetera.
Sure. So again, thank you, Dr. Atkins, and thank you to the organization for inviting us. So just building on what Dr. Weinstock said, last year Pfizer actually looked at the diversity of the trials that are sponsored by Pfizer over the last 5 years, so 2015 to 2020, and this was published. There were more than 200 trials with more than 100,000 participants, but because a significant majority of that are vaccine patients or healthy volunteers, we looked at the data with the vaccine and without the vaccine. Roughly 40 of those 200 patients are oncology, but the rest are internal medicine and others. We then looked at if it's a global trial or US, and it turns out that about 50 to 60% of patients have a minority population that is represented. So certainly it's not 100%, and the goal of Pfizer is the diversity number should be at the US census or above. So we are roughly halfway there. So this is the baseline. Of the 40 or so oncology trials, only about 15% of those trials have a Black or a minority population that is at consensus or above. So that is a baseline that is up to 2020. So over the last couple of years and learning from the COVID vaccine experience, many of the vaccine trials were done in minority when they saw that the enrollment was different in different geographies. So what have we done in the last couple of years? So there was a trial in prostate cancer, and they talked to the Prostate Cancer Foundation and open trials where there may be Black men with prostate cancer, for example. We had a bladder cancer trial recently, and senior leadership at Pfizer started monitoring. So this is a global 1,000-patient randomized trial. So if you're doing a global trial and if you're in China, you need to satisfy the Chinese and the Japanese and the US and European regulatory authorities, and they need patients from China in Arm A and Arm B, the investigational arm and others, and so they need a small number of patients. So we actually monitored the number of patients in the US on a monthly basis, and we're monitoring the diversity metrics of that bladder cancer 1,000-patient trial. So in a 1,000-patient trial, if let's say 200 patients were from the US in bladder cancer, every month they were looking at the percent, and we were throttling back the trial sites that they could enroll patients randomized from sites to hit the diversity metric numbers that leadership was monitoring monthly. So we are doing that for phase 3 trials. We are showing the protocols for phase 2 trials and phase 3 to patient advocates so that they can review the protocol, review the informed consent document, and make changes. Regulatory mandated, we have to keep, but if the patients have suggestions on how to make the protocol better, we are doing that. And then lastly, recently, we are working with the historically Black community colleges. So for example, Meharry College in Tennessee, Tennessee State University, and then Vanderbilt to open trials in the historically underserved communities. And we're planning to do that in the years ahead, both from a grant perspective, focusing it geographically in the US, as well as working with other academic institutions. Now, we can only do that for sponsor trials. For investigator-initiated trials, we can only work with the investigators because they are the holders of the IND. But for company-sponsored trials, we are trying to do that certainly for the registration trials.
Yeah. So Harry, I think you were focusing on placing trials in minority populations, and I want to come back to that. But before we come back to that, Jose, either representing Jose
Okay.
or potentially Exelixis.
Okay.
Can you tell us
Well,
some of the things that Exelixis
sure.
has done to relax the eligibility criteria
So
for clinical trials to make them more representative?
The first thing that when we discussed the 9ER data with investigators, I was made aware that we only have 3 patients, African Americans, in the cabo-nivo arm of 9ER. So that was, for me, surprise, and that started like an internal process to understand where we are today and how can we improve that. We did an advisory board earlier this year and included physicians of other areas, not only GU, but other diseases. And we got some ideas of what can be done to improve the presence of minorities in the clinical trials. We did initially an assessment of the phase 3 trials that Exelixis has done in the recent years, and the percentage of white patients is between 85 and 90% of the patients. So it was higher than what you mentioned in general. So we then discussed what can be done. And in regards to your specific question of relaxing inclusion criteria, I think that there is one step that needs to be done before relaxing, and it's clarification of the definitions. Most of the trial says uncontrolled hypertension, period, or uncontrolled diabetes. And if we exclude patients that may have diabetes and hypertension, we are disproportionately excluding patients from the minorities. So what needs to be at least initially done is to be more specific on the definition of uncontrolled diseases. Because if that definition is not clear enough, it will be in the hands of the investigator who is talking with the patient. And then that person will say, oh, this is an uncontrolled hypertension. And we are not sure if that patient is really taking the drugs. So that seems to be like very obvious, but I think that we need to get into that detail of if patients that we are excluding from the trials are really fitting those definitions. So that would be step one. Then in regard to relaxing the inclusion criteria, that I think that will depend on the drug. If you have a TKI that has liver enzyme elevation as a non-adverse event, it's hard to relax the definition of liver toxicities. But in the case of hypertension, the TKIs have also hypertension as one of the adverse events, and is one of the most relevant adverse events in some of the trials. So I don't think that we can relax that inclusion criteria in the clinical trial. And my suggestion would be that we need to clarify the definition to really exclude patients with uncontrolled by numbers hypertension. Also, I think that there are two words that for me are the most important when we try to improve the recruitment of trials. That's trust and communication. So if we need to gain the trust of the potential patients that will be recruited in the trial, we need to start teaching communities about the importance of clinical trials. So that goes something that far beyond that Exelixis can do, but would be more like an educational activity that we as physicians can go to the field and talk with the general public. This is a clinical trial, and that's why you're not putting your life in danger by participating in a clinical trial. Opposite to that, you're helping the medical community and potential patients to learn about new drugs. So the education and the trust that will be part of that activities will increase the diversity in the trial. And something that the consent informed, that's a very cold document that we usually give to a human being that is not knowledgeable in medical words. And sometimes it's hard. And if we want to increase the presence of diverse population in a clinical trial, we may need to do something different with the informed consent. What can be different? I mean, if we want to increase the presence of African-American patients in a clinical trial, maybe the person that has to deliver the message of the informed consent should be an African-American or a Latino, in the case of the Latino community. And we heard in the advisory board that they suggested us to do a video consent instead of a written document. And we are currently exploring if that's feasible, if that has been done with other companies, and if we can do a video of one of the the patient advocates or the investigators that can communicate in a better way that message to patients, and that can share that with the family. So there are things that can be implemented in the short term that could help the recruitment. And we are learning how to implement those in our clinical trials.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, those are some great answers, and I wanted to have Rick make
Yeah,
some comments.
so I loved what I just heard, but there was a subtle theme in both of the presentations that I'm not sure people picked up on. And it's something that we are now more cognizant of, which is what are the results we are getting at the diversity levels, right? Both of you mentioned that. I know it's important at SWOG because it started to become important. We've not been closely, we have tracking of it, but we're not managing it. And I heard management here, right? So we've moved from this kind of passive, the results are what they are, to we're going to try to at least acknowledge the results and countermeasure them. And then we need to get to the planning that was discussed earlier, because only then can we actually fix this problem.
Well, I mean, in regards to that, the most recent phase 3 trials that we have initiated have the diversity plan already included and discussed with the regulatory agency.
So, Rick, did you want to say anything about how SWOG has maybe addressed the relaxing the eligibility criteria before I go to Chana?
So one of the things we do at SWOG is we make sure we train the patient advocates to be the kind of the backstop for eligibility criteria. So they are supposed to challenge, because we should be challenging them anyway, but we are also educating them on the relationship between eligibility criteria and diversity results. Right? So that's kind of the way we've addressed it. We try to use journal articles where they are journal articles when we, because sometimes the PIs are very willing to listen to a change, but then they have to work with our pharma friends, right? So we try to point them to articles that might help justify a relaxed criteria like the ASCO Friends of Cancer Research, broadened eligibility, that kind of thing. So that's kind of the way we've approached it as well.
So Chana, I hear companies and cooperative group being willing to consider relaxing some of the eligibility criteria, but when it comes to getting a drug approved, I know that they don't want to be presenting a lot of toxicity to the FDA, and there might be more toxicity in patients with worse performance status, or a patient with diabetes, or a patient with uncontrolled hypertension, or a patient with brain mets, and so they put those eligibility criteria in to have better results to present to the FDA. How does the FDA deal with the fact that you're also trying to make sure that drugs are safe and effective, but you're going to be receiving stuff from companies that's trying to protect themselves from you saying this is too toxic?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it comes back to the fact that, you don't want to be approving a drug that's really too toxic for patients in the real world, and not in this pristine clinical trial setting where you've removed, anyone with any sort of predisposition to having toxicity. Patients are in the real world, and we definitely want representativeness. So, I mean, how can you do that? So in our guidance on including older adults, we talk about including separate cohorts, possibly if you're worried that, older adults might, for other reasons, just not be the population, part of the population that you want to randomize, like your primary population. We talk about that with variant histology, where you think there might be differential outcomes, organ impairment, et cetera. There are ways to incorporate patients onto a clinical trial and get data from them. If you have specific concerns about toxicity or how to enroll them in the overall randomized population. Having said that, I think randomization definitely does take care of a lot of the concerns. So if you have patients with poor performance status or whatever it is, who you think otherwise would be able to tolerate your drug, And you don't, obviously, if you have a specific concern, if uncontrolled hypertension with your drug, et cetera, then those patients should probably not be receiving the drug on a clinical trial or in the real world. Like if there's a real specific safety signal that you're seeing and you have a rational reason for excluding that patient, that's one thing. But if there's just general, the patient's older, the patient has organ impairment, et cetera, and you think that they can still safely get the drug, when you randomize patients, that definitely takes care of some of the concerns. And if there are safety signals, we want to know about them. So I think that's part of our consideration as well.
So are you envisioning that as part of the diversity plan, that things would be done sort of as Hari was suggesting, that you would have certain target levels for certain minorities in the trial, and that you would close off certain populations if they've exceeded what the percentage would be, so that you could accrue people who might be from diverse populations? Does that ever happen? Because that might delay the trial, which might delay the approval of the drug getting out to the community. I'm now speaking like I'm from pharma. And is that really the endpoint that you want?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think the guidance definitely focuses on some of the things that we heard, our considerations in terms of setting targets and how to get there with community engagement and active monitoring to make sure those targets are being met, and then feedback to the FDA, as you're going through your trial and monitoring, et cetera. I don't think that there's any intention of, cutting off trials for groups who are overrepresentative. I think it's really the opposite focus is increasing representativeness and diversity. By actively monitoring enrollment targets and seeing if you're way off, et cetera. So I think that's really more of the emphasis of the guidance, and you're welcome to look at it. It's a draft guidance, which means it's a work in progress, and there are many strategies outlined there as to how to best do this. It's obviously not a comprehensive strategy plan, but things like community engagement and site selection and all of those things that have come up are definitely mentioned there. So these are things that we encourage.
Yeah, so that's good. So I live in DC. DC is majority minority. And we have, as part of our cancer center, a major community hospital, Washington Hospital Center, that has 80% minority population. And for us to accrue minorities to kidney cancer trials, we need to open the trial at MedStar Washington Hospital Center. But when we go to pharmaceutical companies and say, could we have this other site as a satellite for us, or that either is sometimes allowed but sometimes rejected because we don't have always direct oversight of the patients there, or them being a separate site just adds to the number of sites that the CRO is going to charge you for. So one solution would be to open trials at minority hospitals or hospitals that serve diverse populations. A lot of the cancer centers have those, are in central cities and have collaborations with those type of hospitals. How does Pfizer address that?
Yeah, so clearly don't know about this specific trial, but recently what Pfizer is doing is on a trial by trial and case by case basis. It's not just about where the trials are, but what are the challenges for the individual patients, right? So it might be loss of job to take a day off to come to a trial. So Pfizer is actually starting to reimburse out-of-pocket expenses for the patients in a clinical trial. But they also don't want to lose their income. So the Pfizer travel desk is willing to pre-book travel or reimburse travel for patients to come to a clinical trial site. And sometimes they're even willing to pay them for filling e-diaries or surveys and giving a stipend. Of course, per the law, then it's not, you want to incentivize them to or bias them, but working with the sites and the investigators, there may be many reasons, not only not knowing about the trial and fear about past, but are there barriers that can be removed for certain populations? And Pfizer is actually working with that in recent trials, so that could be one option to think
So
about.
are you building those into the contracts? For
We're
those
talking
trials?
with each one of those investigators on those trials, and PfizerClinicalTrials.com, for example, has more details, but happy to chat further, but there are ways to mitigate some of these challenges.
And Jose, do you want to?
I mean, probably
Jose or Exelixis?
I think that it's about on the same line. And as it was mentioned before, that needs to be included from the get-go of the trials. It's not, oh, we have half recruited and we are having difficulties. So from the very beginning, we need to include these supports to patients attending the investigational sites and different ways of doing that, transport, food, or some support that will help. And that's part of what is going to be included in the clinical trials from the very beginning. And one thing that was mentioned about investigator-initiated trials, I know that that's an area that we are always hands off, and we don't make any inclusion into the trials. But in our communication with investigators, we suggest them to include a diversity plan as part of the final protocol when they write it.
Can I actually ask you something? Yeah, or well, I
Go
guess
ahead.
from our front.
Okay.
Because you mentioned some flexibility and maybe some innovative ways of getting patients or breaking the barriers down. And this came up during our panel. One of the things that happened during COVID-19 was an introduction to some extent of flexibility. So like maybe telehealth visits, or maybe doing labs at a local laboratory instead of having to come to some academic center that's 3 hours away from the patient's home. Has that continued? Like, have you incorporated that successfully? Because that's one of the strategies that we talk about a little bit in the guidance. I'm just curious.
Yes, so we have to see if it can be done globally, but if in many places that have electronic medical records, or in the US, certainly that is an option. So actually, yes, Pfizer is looking into how can we do local labs to answer your specific question. It has to be validated. We have to collect the baseline for regulatory purposes, but yes, that is being looked at, not just in the vaccine trials, but many other trials also.
Question from the audience.
Yes. Go ahead.
I have a question for Dr. Weinstock. So when you have a global trial where only 100 patients or 150 patients out of 1,200 patients going to be recruited from the United States, would you take into account 10% African American men to be enrolled of total of 1,100 or 1,200 patients, or among those patients who are enrolled in the US? Because every country has different definition of diversity. India has different underserved population versus Australia. So that's first question. And second is comment. We cannot increase the availability of these trials in underserved area or inner city areas if CROs keep piling up paperwork. I've been in trial business for at least 10 years, and I've seen the paperwork going up by at least 500% or 5 times. I don't know if somebody would disagree with me, but paperwork keep piling up. How can those poor resourced sites have access to so many CRCs and study coordinators to take care of those data? So first question is the question, but I wanted to make that comment. Thank you very much.
You want to respond to that?
That's a great
Chana?
Yeah, so I mean, when you come in with your trial that you're talking about in a meeting, or when you submit your protocol, and you're really targeting an international trial population, it's definitely something we think about. If you only have limited sites in the United States, you do have to come up with a plan that makes sure the rest of your enrollees do have that there's some representation that would translate to the US population, because we are a US regulatory agency. Now, whether, I've heard talk about trying to enroll sites in Africa, for example, that might translate into more diversity that's relevant to the US. That could be one solution, but it's definitely not, you just can't have your small percentage of enrollees in the US and say that, we've kind of satisfied the diversity requirements. It really is, we understand that trials are global nowadays, but it's certainly something that you need to look at in the context of your entire clinical trial population. And certainly if it's entirely ex-US and you aren't addressing this at all, that's something that we're really going to comment on as soon as we see that that's your plan, if you bring a trial like that for review.
So, Raj, with regard to your comment, I participated in a crisis in clinical research effort that SITSI put on, and one of the conclusions from that long discussion was that CROs who get paid by the amount of work that they do are actually intentionally increasing the workload because it's their business model. And some companies, I think Merck is one of them, is actually, I hope there are not a lot of CROs in the room, have actually decided to forgo CROs and take everything in-house because of that reason. And so it may be something that the academic community needs to push back on. And one potential point that we could make to do that is it's interfering with diversity in clinical trials and opening trials in minority centers.
Yeah.
Yes,
So,
go ahead.
So thanks, Mike. Great session, and this is very important. But I mean, we all know that there are cultural, maybe subcultural factors that contribute to a lower participation in clinical trials among minorities. But really, I think the main factor, there are two factors in my opinion that contribute to that disparity. One is financial. You spoke about it. Unless, industry will be willing to cover travel expenses, ground transportation, etc., you're not going to increase the participation among, African Americans. And but the other important thing is universal healthcare coverage. Unless we go into a universal healthcare coverage, look at what is the percentage of minorities in the population. Those minorities are underinsured and uninsured. There is a disproportionate percentage of uninsured and underinsured. We really, you're not going to have that participation unless we're talking about equity. The equity has to be with healthcare insurance. Everybody has to have similar healthcare insurance. Otherwise, you're not going to get. We can talk about it all day long, all year long. We're not going to bring in those people on clinical trials. It's not that they don't see the importance of clinical trials. I can speak about RMC, Dr. Musawala and myself. Patients will come from any state whenever they see there is a clinical trial that's specific for RMC patients, but they can't get to MD Anderson because they are either uninsured or have Medicaid and they're trapped in their state insurance. They can't access MD Anderson. And they won't access the other academic centers. So really, talking about participation of minorities, we really need to level the playing field. Everybody has to have insurance, like Congress people, congressmen and women. Thank you.
Well, I think those are great points. And I was listening to American Association of Cancer Institute panel on this topic just a couple of days ago. And I think they made the point that although there might be cultural differences, it's not the reason why minority communities don't participate in clinical trials. And too often it's because the person explaining the trial doesn't understand the issues related to that particular individual. Person designing the trial doesn't understand the issues related to minority populations. And the financial issues like transportation may be an obstacle, but too frequently people aren't asking the patient why they don't want to participate in the trial, why they're declining, and sometimes there may be obstacles that can be overcome if you just sit there and ask them and get an honest answer about why they're declining, and it may not be for the reasons that you think.
Rick, quick question for you. One of the interesting thing, we've been involved in cooperative group for a long time, is the breadth and depth of the sites the cooperative groups have. Certainly, at least in my experience, more diversity of sites. I'm not going diversity something else. Diversity of sites. I remember those calls at midnight from University of Hawaii asking me to comment if a patient is eligible compared to what pharma opens. So when you look at SWOG specifically, is there more in terms of patients that are Black American or Pacific Islanders or other enrolled compared to pharma trials? Do you have that data?
So I can tell you that the data, which I have recently seen, suggests that we are under accruing African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanics, older populations. So we have the data now and we're looking at it.
But compared to pharma, the comparison is not to the US census population.
Yeah, I can't speak to the comparison to pharma. I just know how, in my opinion, how poorly we are doing. There is a site component of this, but the challenge with the cooperative groups, now called network groups, is that it's kind of a voluntary network, right? So you volunteer to be on the network, and then you volunteer to be on the trial. So you raise your hand twice. MD Anderson, I will be part of SWOG, and now I will participate in this kidney cancer trial. Okay, until we get to the point where we're actively managing the portfolio of sites and do it at the trial level, and I think we need to one day get there. We're gonna struggle with this. The NCORE sites, which are supposed to help balance, aren't gonna do it.
I mean, I think it's twofold. I think we need to bring the trials to the patients and not have the patients come to the trials. And we need the people that are introducing the trials to the patients to look like the patients, speak like the patients, and understand what the patients are going through. And it's a multi-pronged approach. You can't provide the same resources. Like, this is sort of like the, X company's budget for onboarding it. That same package can't be the same for trying to resource a rural center that doesn't have, they are going to need more infrastructural support, and that is the onus is on our pharma team to help provide that infrastructure support for them, and then additional research. And then I think we as a medical community, at the levels of ASCO or institutions, need to be bringing up people in the field that look and talk and are of diverse populations.
Yeah, I mean, until we start recognizing social determinants of health, or what I now understand to be called health-related social risks, until we start acknowledging that, we're never going to fix this.
Mike, you'd asked Rick about SWOG, and I can sort of speak to the SWOG experience from the investigator side. I have to tell you, and a lot of credit here goes to Jose and to Hari for supporting trials like SWOG 1500, which had a big hand from Exelixis and Pfizer and AstraZeneca as well. There's a papillary kidney cancer trial where you expect about 15% of the population to be African American. What was the enrollment of African Americans in our study? 15%. 15%. So it was right where we wanted it to be, right? Which I think is quite impressive. And I think that lends itself to the fact that SWOG and the cooperative groups have reach into the NCORPs and, some of these, diverse sites. Neeraj's trial, SWOG 1216, trial of TAC 700 and MCSPC, actually represents the trial with the highest proportion of African Americans enrolled amongst all MCSPC trials, 10%. So there's something to the formula of doing trials within the cooperative groups. And, maybe we ought to be investing a little bit more and maybe attempting registration trials through the cooperative groups. I mean, you did Cabo Sun there, right, Tony? I mean, it's possible.
But what Reina said is true. You have to, and pharma is not doing that simply. It's really not doing that. So the example that you gave, Mike, about DC, well, DC has also a large white population. Why don't you go to centers in New Mexico? What about Detroit and this? And you have to invest more. And you're not doing that because it's harder. But you can't at the same time say you're committed to diversity. It's your trial at the end of the day. You can't push us to accrue because that patient will not come. You have to go to them.
So do you want to have a final comment?
No, to the point about research staff also being diverse, not just the patients. So Pfizer gave a grant to Columbia University. It's a 3-year, $10 million grant to increase diversity of the patients in Columbia, which is, Harlem and the Bronx and others. One of the goals of that research grant was also to increase the diversity of the staff of the clinical trial at Columbia University, and that is also being monitored. So we have a baseline and we work with them. It's public information, but it's also to look at, is your staff diverse? That is going to talk to the community also. So that's an example. It's a pilot grant and we'll see what happens. So maybe Washington, DC is another place and maybe other places are next.
We'll get that grant out soon. So the time is up. I think we could talk about this for another hour or two, but I think we've just sort of touched the surface, had some great ideas proposed, and clearly this is a big problem and a lot of thought's going to go into it. It's not going to be solved by one organization or one group of organizations. We all have to decide it's a priority and then work together to solve it. So thank you, the panelists, for participating and sharing your ideas. And thanks to the KCRS for inviting us to have this panel.
Final comment, Dr. Tom Powell's entered the